So I actually agree that moral language, the language of morality, the good and the bad, the should and the shouldn't, always is describing, in a moral sense, whenever you're talking about morality, is an action's relation to suffering, right? I just can't think of anyone calling something good that just causes suffering without any good attached to that, right? It's just, that's what the bad is. The bad is to suffer, right? Now, here's where I have a little bit of a question, though, because morality as I view it, and I want to see what you think of this. I'm actually going to pull up a slide here for us to take a look at. And it's this notion that morality equals value. So we could say it's something's relationship to suffering, the good and the bad part of it, right? But plus obligation. And the reason I want to bring in this idea of obligation is because I think it's important to understand that when people are talking about morality, they're not just saying what is good and bad in their opinion, right? When I'm talking about morality, I'm saying you should do this. You have an obligation to behave in a particular way. I'm not merely stating that, because otherwise it'd just be my preference. Like, yeah, I think Captain Crunch is good. Maybe you don't. Maybe you think that it's bad. But those are just value judgments. It's very different when I say, no, like Captain Crunch is good and you should therefore eat it, right? We have to, like, morality tends to deal with what we should and should not do, not simply what we value and don't value, right? Now, I just want to stop there. And is that a fair way of, is obligation an essential ingredient in this equation?
I'm going to, for the purpose of discussion, I'll say yes. That I'll agree with you that if I follow what you're saying, I'll pick up what you're putting down here. Is that, yeah, I'd say that morality is about how should we interact with each other within the context in order to maximize our well-being, right? We talked, and I know you've talked about Sam Harris and the moral landscape. He talks a lot about well-being. Sam Harris the moral landscape is really just a restatement of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, right? It's just the same thing. Most happiness for the most amount of people, and we try and evaluate things. What Sam is saying in the moral landscapes, he believes that science can come in and help inform this, this debate or this discussion, rather than saying it's purely something that religion can do. That's kind of his approach. Yeah, and I tend to agree with him.
Frankly, yeah. I think I'm a big fan of Sam Harris's work. Now this is where I get into, there's an area when we get into the notion of obligation, I tend to wonder, where is the basis for that? Because it's one thing to say that human flourishing is, great, but what if I don't care about the general human flourishing? What if I care about just the human flourishing of my tribe and my genes in a competitive world? Like, why is there any obligation to go beyond the well-being of those that I care about and that affect me? Because ultimately, if someone's well-being in no way affects mine, why should I sacrifice it? Like for instance, like, maybe I could do something today that would affect some alien on some planet a bajillion miles away for the better in a bajillion years from now. Why am I under an obligation to take that action? Right? So I guess this is where I really have a problem, where my challenge is with Sam, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say, is we all talk about human flourishing or he uses the word well-being, which I actually think is a better term. We always talk about human well-being in sort of the ether. My question is when the rubber hits the road, the well-being that I care about is my own. And the reason I care about the well-being of my children and those around me is because it affects my own well-being. So where does this notion come from that I have some sort of an obligation to humanity as a general thing, rather than just to my gene pool and the people that I care about?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. You're hitting on a lot of moral philosophy, right? Once you step away from the religious philosophy, which to me seems to be mostly about, you follow these principles and rules that have been passed to you by revelation. You get over into the non-religious world of philosophy, and you do run into exactly the question you're pointing about. Well, why would I care about anybody else? Why isn't it just a war of all against all? You know, like the Hobbesian Leviathan idea that we need a government to try and impose upon us, otherwise we can't handle it ourselves, right? Why be good? Why be moral? That's the question you're asking, right?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, even to define morality, if morality is defined as some, you know, as I look at it, as the relationship of an action to suffering, well, I care about my suffering and the suffering of those that I care about more than anyone else. And in fact, from a purely genetic standpoint, you know, let's just take the hard example here. Adolf Hitler's idea was we need to genetically breed up the stock, filter out the weak, and basically create a, you know, it's the supremacist mindset. It's my genes, my tribe, my pool, everyone else can go to hell, and burn them all down. And I worry that the social Darwinism is a very easy step to take unless you have an answer to the question for why following the gen, because, you know, you're saying we got these sentiments from evolution. Well, evolution doesn't tell me to love all of humanity. It tells me to spread my genes. It also tells me that I'm in a competition for survival in a world of limited resources. So I'm just going to put that out there and say, like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question to ask. And for a long time, historically, and I think you guys will agree with this, that it was a lot of wars and people fighting over this historically, right? It's not really until the Enlightenment, which I think did come out of Christianity, that you start to focus on the individual and the rights of the individual. You know, the divine individual comes out of Christianity, right? And then gets picked up by the Enlightenment to say, well, governments, rather than existing by divine right, you know, that God put governments into place in order to enforce morality. In order to do this, well, maybe governments exist for the rights of the people, for human, and in order to maximize their flourishing. This is, you know, the John Locke philosophy and what we then see in the United States of America approach. And it is kind of new, right? That's why it makes it cool and exciting. It's the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I say we've made progress in our moral arc, right? That at one time it was very tribal and just localized to the people who you lived with. And then we got bigger and we got into cities and states. And when we did that, we had to take those moral sentiments and objectify them into a rule of law, right? So you see like the Code of Hammurabi, you know, like 1,000 years before the Mosaic Law, where they're talking about this on their code, you know, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not murder. And this is before there's anything Abrahamic, right? And then we just keep growing these out. And now we're at a level where we're talking about a species level thing. And so
I guess I'm just wondering, like, why would the morality of a tribal society who wants to take over and dominate, why is their morality, like, by what standard are you judging that morality to be more like not like, if you're gonna have progress, there has to be some way that we're measuring that progress, and you're using the rubric of general human flourishing as that standard. But that standard in my mind seems to be kind of arbitrary, because the way I see it is you're choosing the flourishing of the entire whole with the arbitrary boundary of human beings instead of including animals and everything else in it, because, you know, we make animals suffer all the time for our well-being. And but so
we'd want to include those too, because they're conscious, right?
Okay,
to a certain level, right? Yeah, but yeah,
fair enough. And maybe that's another discussion or another point to go into. But I guess what I'm saying is another group prefers their tribe and not universal humanity. Why is one of those answers right and one of those wrong? Or is it just arbitrary that you chose to go with the whole of humanity and they chose to go with the group, and neither side has the quote unquote right answer? Like, how do you adjudicate that issue?
Yeah, and that's where I think we can relate to the Sam Harris stuff, or the utilitarian approach, which is we look for the most good for the most people, right? You start approaching it from a standpoint of.
But isn't that just an arbitrary presupposition?
Well, it's arbitrary if you look at it from the standpoint of the entire universe or whatever, right? But if you look at it from species of us living together on this planet, and we all have to get along, it starts to make rational sense.
But do we all have to get along? I mean, what if enslaving, 5% of the population increases the well-being of 95%?
Right. So you're, if that were a case, then you might have something. But so far we haven't been able to find a situation, right? I think throughout history where you can throw away your moral sentiments about a certain group of people or whatever, and still improve the well-being of the people who are the enslavers, right?
If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.